Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I just want to say, if anyone has seen werewolves or anything like that, I've been getting reports of sightings and stuff all over Europe the past few weeks. It's been going crazy. If you've got a story you want to share, or a video clip or anything like that, please send it over to me. It is really interesting, and I'm super excited right now. But anyway, for today, I've got some really cool and disturbing werewolf and cryptid stories for your listening pleasure. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm a skeptic of the supernatural, but I believe anything is possible. I won't discount supernatural occurrences if I can't find a logical explanation for them. I've experienced a few incidents I couldn't explain, but I'm going to tell you about the one that freaked me out the most. I live in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota, USA. A lot of people in the cities have cabins in either northern Minnesota or rural Wisconsin. Our cabin was in rural Wisconsin, in a small town called Danbury. The cabin is on a long lake, at the very end of Long Lake Road, and along with the cabin came an almost entire acre of land, covered by thick forest. We carved a trail through the land for ATVs and whatnot, so the scene is set. Now, about me. I'm an outdoors enthusiast and have been forever. I'm 6'4", fit, and have been a hunter since I was 12. I know my environment, the wildlife, and the forest well. I'm typically comfortable in the woods. I come from a military family and am trained in multiple forms of combat, armed and unarmed. I also have extensive firearms training, and as a result am fairly confident in my abilities to defend myself. I'm not really scared of people. Big predators on the other hand, like bears, wolves, man-bear, pig, whatever, I'm not a big fan of. This brings me to the wilderness. I'm 23 now, but at the time of the incident I was 16. Even at 16, I was a decent hunter and had good common sense. Anyway, I was at the cabin with my cousins and my grandparents. It was the middle of summer, I think July. My cousins and I were shooting at each other with airsoft guns, and we had a full-on battle going on through the property, including the woods, which were my stalking grounds. I was wearing my BDUs with face cover, as well as camo head to toe. Our battle ended up about 100 yards northwest of the cabin, into the woods. We ended the war on the main trail and were standing and talking about the events that had transpired. I was still on guard, because I always am. I suppose I could be considered a tad paranoid. Alright, so we were standing there talking when I noticed something move at our 12 o'clock, about 50 meters out. I got quiet and focused, dead ahead scanning. My cousin was still talking, so I whispered, "Shh," so he shut up. I figured the movement I had seen was just a bird. As a joke, and to freak him out, I told him we were being watched. That's when I noticed that the woods were dead quiet. Not a bird chirping, no insect sounds, nothing. And I realized that only happened when there's a big predator. So I look even closer. That's when I saw it. At my 12 o'clock was a large animal. It had reddish-brown fur and almost blended in perfectly until I focused on it. It had long, front limbs, arm-like, with what appeared to be formidable claws, and it was standing kind of slouched down against a tree, like it was trying to be stealthy. Even though it was standing like that, it was nearly as tall as me. The only reason I saw it was because of the teeth. I think it was panting, because its whitish teeth were visible. Its snout appeared to be a tad elongated. I couldn't get a better look because my first thought was, we have to go. I even said it out loud. My cousin was already freaked, but when I said those words, he bolted up the trail towards the cabin. He nearly left me in the dust, because instead of running when he did, I waited a good 3 seconds as I was being protected of him, keeping my eye on it until I saw it move, and it was fast. That's when I ran like hell. I didn't see which way it went. All I knew was that I heard it crashing through the woods. My cousin stopped at the shed, which was still 50 meters from the cabin, to wait for me. When I caught up, I yelled to go, and we both bolted to the cabin. We entered and shut the door. My grandma asked why we looked so panicked, and had slammed the door shut. I knew they wouldn't believe me, so I said we'd seen a bear. My cousin nodded. Later that night, after my grandparents went to sleep, we spoke about it, and I asked my cousin if he had seen it. He told me that he had paused for a second to look back, after we ran, to see if it was running with him. He said he had mostly just seen a flash of fur, and went on to say he thought it wasn't the right color to be a bear. I also agreed that it wasn't the right color to be one, and told him that we only had black bears in the area, and that it wasn't built like a bear either. I told him I never thought it was a bear. He asked me why I had lied about it to my grandparents. I told him they wouldn't have believed us, and we kept it between the two of us until now. Still, the animal didn't match any known regional animal profile in the area, and I'm at a loss for what it might have been. I do know that it was stalking us though, and that it was built like an athletic predator, not like a bear. It wasn't as heavy set. After the incident, neither of us would go into the woods on foot alone without a gun. We generally only went back into the woods on ATVs from that point on. I always loved that cabin, up until then. Fortunately now, it has been sold. About 2 years ago, I had my first encounter with something I can't explain. And the reason I'm writing this is because I saw some strange footprints yesterday, where I encountered this 2 years ago. I live in Finland near the coast. 2 years ago I was hunting, and it was getting late and dark, so I decided to head back home. I had about a 2 to 3 kilometer walk through the forest to get to my car. It had gotten pitch black outside at this point, and I had a headlamp for light as I walked. As I was walking, I kept hearing unusually loud sounds. Now I knew something big was moving, and I was 100% sure it was a moose, as I've encountered lots of them in the forest, and they do make a lot of noise when they walk. I couldn't see anything though, and it was getting closer, when all of a sudden, I met with this horrific smell. It sounded like crap and garbage had mixed together, really rotten. My hair was standing on end, so I raised my shotgun as my whole body instinctively tells me to run. But I stand still and listen. As the sound gets closer, I see what looks like a humanoid figure standing on 2 feet, really tall. It had to be at least 2 meters tall, but slender and muscular at the same time, and kind of crouched in its posture. It looked almost like a werewolf from the movies, but at the same time not. It was quite far away. My light didn't go that far and I could hardly see it, but its eyes shined red from my headlamp. It looked at me for about 3 seconds, made no sound. It was breathing weirdly, and I think it could smell the 2 ducks that I'd hunted in my backpack. It slowly walked away. I even filmed a bit of it as it began walking with my phone, but it's potato quality, as my phone at the time was an old Samsung S2, and it was dark, so you really can't see it, just hear lots of noise. I told some friends and fellow hunters, and a couple have heard and seen strange things, but nothing like this. Is this a creature or something paranormal? This happened about 7 years ago. I was coming home from work into my dad's neighborhood. I was staying with him temporarily due to finances or lack thereof, when I saw something that I simply can't explain. I wasn't too far from the house when I see something from the corner of my eye. I turn my head, and I see this thing walking behind one of the larger houses. It was skinny, covered in grey fur, hugely intimidating. I only glimpsed it for a moment, but it stuck with me. The only way I can properly describe it was that it appeared to be a werewolf. Don't laugh. I fully realize how crazy it sounds, but I've never known wolves to be 6 feet tall, walk on their hind legs, and that is exactly what this creature was doing. I'm glad I didn't see it after, as I was thoroughly creeped out. This encounter happened last night while I was hiking with my husband and son. We went hiking to this spot in Southern California where we've been going for the last 13 years. The hiking trails are basically located all along the cliff. Some trails lead to a secluded beach, others to a cave. We took the trail that leads to the beach, and we usually kept walking longer than the average person, since we are more familiar with the terrain after the trail ends. Around 4:30, we decided to hike back up the trail while watching the sunset. At the same time, the moon was rising in the opposite direction. This moon was huge, probably one of the biggest moons I've ever seen, and we decided once we got back to the top of the trail around 5:30 p.m. to keep hiking along some other trail, which we've only been to once. The night was still young and plenty of families were walking among them, and I decided to take a quick break after a short jog to enjoy the scenery and appreciate the moon. At this time, my husband and son were pretty far from me, and all I could see was their silhouette. The night was now upon us, and the fog from the Pacific Ocean was making its way up the cliff into the hiking trails. My husband and son decided to turn back and meet me because it was getting dark. My son began to run past us. At this point, my husband looks towards his direction and sees this black silhouette of a tall person standing around 9 meters from my son. As soon as this thing notices that my husband is looking at it, it gets on all fours and takes off like an animal. He yells for my son to come back. He then tells me what he saw and says something is running across the trail. I'm scared of dogs, so the first thing I thought was that it must have been a stray dog running loose. But he said no, it's bigger than a dog, almost the size of a bear, but it had the silhouette of a man standing in the middle of the trail, and it took off running on all fours as soon as I saw it. He said this thing was darker than the darkness around us. At this point, we were freaking the hell out. We were hugging each other close, not knowing what to expect next. We were basically in the middle of a trail we've only been in once with terrible phone service. We looked around the trail, and it was completely empty. We were basically the only ones there. The trail went from being packed with people to now us three being the only ones there within minutes, which made everything ever more terrifying. We decided to suck it up and walk back to our car, which meant we had to pass by where my husband saw the thing. My husband said he thought he saw this thing run down the trail, but once we got to the spot where he saw it, the trail turns right, but the figure ran left. To the left was a fence and a bunch of tall bushes, making it impossible for something to go that way. Whatever it was must have jumped the fence to keep going. We never saw or heard it jump, and better yet, we didn't even hear footsteps or anything move in the bushes. My husband said it just disappeared. We managed to keep walking along the trail while holding his phone flashlight, pointed at the fence and bushes where he saw it go towards, and all I had was my water bottle, and I was ready to use it as a weapon. All we could hope for at this time was to see other people coming down the trail. Then we finally see lights coming from a motorbike towards the end of it. This person was going into the trail as we were relieved to be out of it and into the parking lot. When we finally got there, it went from 50 cars to only 2 cars left. There was a couple outside taking pictures. At this point, even the person in the motorbike noped out of the trail to the parking lot and left. We made our way back out to our car, and I joked with my husband how we may have seen a werewolf. He was still in shock and didn't say no, but was still trying to process what he saw. My son said he saw something crawling, and that's when my husband called him to come back towards us. He was really scared that night and refused to sleep by himself. We all slept in the same room. My son said he felt like it was following us the whole time. I hope not. Today we ended up watching this segment on the news by accident while having dinner, and we heard that today is a super blood wolf moon. Now I'm 90% convinced he saw a werewolf, 5% it was a shapeshifter, and 5% a shadow person. This location is notorious for many deaths as it's on a cliff where many have died from falling over. When we first went there, for the first time, there was a sign around the same place he saw this thing about a person who lost its life falling from the cliff. Others have drowned at that location too. Just down the road from where a few years ago I had previously lived in Southeast Australia is the opening to about 100 acres of woodland and bush that I frequently went in when I was younger to do the usual thing, riding, camping and stuff. I was out driving at about 11:30 p.m. with my girlfriend. As we were in the area, I decided to show her the woodlands while we were in the area, as she loved everything to do with nature, and it was summer and a very warm night. I left my car with the light shining into the trees as we weren't going too far in, and it was pitch black inside, and the two of us kind of just sat chatting, having a smoke and generally relaxing. She was sitting on a map of the area that had been put in on some plastic, and I was keeping an eye on the trees, and I had the distinct feeling that something was wrong. Now I've heard and read that people say that they just get this feeling when they're in danger, even though they can't see anything around them, that it just felt off. I was experiencing this very feeling. Every sense was almost reaching out, and my adrenaline was up, but there wasn't really anything in my eye line that seemed any different. After lighting another cigarette to calm my nerves, I scanned the tree line again and realized that it looked different to before. It was only after staring into the darkness that I saw that there was moonlight now, lighting up grass where there wasn't before, and there was a black shape blocking it. At first, I thought it was a tree. I got goosebumps just remembering this. All sound just ceased, and everything went dead silent. And a few seconds later, this disgusting feeling of dread washed over me. I saw motion in the dark of the path, and this thing crawled towards us on all fours. I've seen nearly every animal in the outback here, and we don't have any large predators like the US or Europe, but somehow I knew this thing was a predator, and it wasn't hiding itself from us, but slowly crawling forward towards us. I don't know if my girlfriend saw it. It was night, and I couldn't look away. But just as it reached the line of my car lights, and it was about to be illuminated, it reared up on two legs and was staring at us. I am 6'4", and this thing had about another meter on me, with arms that were far too long and reached near the ground. All I could make out was an off-whitish, almost yellowish fur on it, and in the dim light, I could make out the silhouette of its head. It looked like a dog or wolf. I wasn't able to move as it stared at me. But it was at this point my girlfriend gasped, which seemed to break whatever was stopping me from logically thinking, as I grabbed her by the arm and sprinted to my car, slammed on the doors and tore out of there as fast as I could, both of us too scared to speak, until about a half hour later. We've both discussed it many times, and the feeling that we had was what I imagine rabbits see when it catches a wolf or fox looking at it. That is something that will be able to end us with absolute ease if it so chooses. Neither of us have been able to come up with an explanation for what it was, but it has definitely changed the way I view the woods and bush when I go camping or hiking now. I think back to that and wonder what it was and if I will ever see anything like it again. I have been hesitant on posting this story due to the fact I don't want anyone ever thinking that I, or the person the story is about, is crazy. but I must say this actually happened. I'm an intern for a church that does work on a Navajo reservation site, helping the community of people roof their homes, repaint, do interior fixing and stuff like that. With good pay and nice people. So overall, I'm happy with this. And just as a disclaimer, I'm still in my 20s, and I'm not trying to offend any Navajo reservation traditions in any way. This is just a first-hand story on what is currently happening on my trip. You see, on the past 2 months of the internship, I've begun to grow fairly close with some of the residents on the reservation. One lady in particular that I got to know pretty well was the superstitious type, and say things like to never be outside at night, or other randomly seeming things to me. But the biggest taboo I knew to never mention, mainly because I was told by my superiors, was Navajo folklore, like skinwalkers. However, one day it was very different in the sense that the question was just burning within me. I was on my lunch break after wrapping up painting part of her house, and she sits next to me on the porch and we talk for a while, until I finally feel comfortable enough to ask her about any folklore or anything of the sort that she can tell me, like werewolves and stuff. I didn't really expect a response. I thought maybe she'd quickly say no, then change the topic, but if anything, I was more scared I may offend her. But to my surprise, she turns her head, looking towards the outside scenery, hesitates and then says, "Yes, I know some, and I've experienced some too." She proceeds to tell me a description of the apparent equivalent to a werewolf. To paraphrase what she said, werewolves look like normal people, but masked in white paint covering their face, arms, and chest. Their whole body as white as a corpse covered with black symbols, quite possibly related to devil worshipping. More specifically, they're gravediggers and necromancers, digging up bodies and stealing jewelry, although they may perform other acts to corpses. She quickly strayed away from going too much into detail. Werewolves also, allegedly, draw their power from the devil. That is how they're able to possess such supernatural strength and endurance. I was surprised to hear this, although I didn't think that werewolves would look anything like how they did in Twilight or Scooby-Doo. Deep down, I thought she sounded a bit crazy, and before I could ask any more questions, she began to tell me her own interaction with these supernatural beasts. She explained that one day her and her husband were driving on the curvy roads alongside the mountains, only to find a woman with her face covered by her hands, kneeling in the middle of the road, that appeared to be crying. The woman looks up towards the car's headlights to reveal the very same white paint and sacrificial symbols mentioned previously. Her husband honked the horn and quickly slams on the brakes, only to be too late, and hears the loud cracking sound as the woman's bones and flesh splashes all over the windshield. Once her and her husband stop the car safely and proceed to analyze what the hell happened, they quickly run over to the spot where they hit the woman. However, once they reach the spot, there was no body, but not only that, there was no trace of blood either. Just as a side note, this part of the reservation had some cliffs, but it was relatively flat, so it would be obvious to tell where someone is, especially if they just got hit by a car. Puzzled by what the possible explanation could be for this occurrence, her and her husband drove back, trying to neglect the thought that they just saw a werewolf. However, being the non-paranormal believers they were at the time, they tried to close this occurrence off as them just losing their minds temporarily. As interesting as her story was, this got me thinking, is it possible for werewolf stories to be true? Or is this her own way of describing a skinwalker or other supernatural phenomenon? Because she didn't think I knew what a skinwalker was? This question began circulating my mind. So as you would expect after hearing such a story, That night it was very hard for me to sleep comfortably. Because of that, during the work days, I'd feel more and more mentally drained and almost paranoid. At the end of the week, at around 6, I was sitting in the car driving back to the church site and was in the mental state of mind where I was half awake and half asleep. My buddy was driving and claimed that he wanted to pull over to the gas station that was near the church to grab a few snacks to munch on during our brief time in our cabin. Since I was too tired to argue, I said fine and laid my face against the window and tried to doze off while waiting for my friend. However, I had the weirdest feeling that I was being watched, so naturally I opened my eyes and looked out the window. I saw nothing. However, when I turned my head out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a white figure, just as the woman described previously. I looked back, and nothing was there. But I swear I saw something, since it was the beginning to get darker outside. I quickly sat up in my seat to readjust my vision, but when I looked back out the window, it was almost as though the figure vanished. Perplexed, I stepped outside the car and looked around, but there was no trace of a creature ever existing. My buddy comes back to the car and questions what the heck I was doing, debating whether or not I should tell him. I decide to say that I was just getting some fresh air. The following days got worse though. My mood is getting worse. I'm feeling a lot more paranoid that something's out there, and at night I can almost swear that I hear screams in the distance. Everything outside just looks 100 times scarier too, because there's barely any light outside besides the moonlight, so everything has more of an exaggerated appearance. But believe me, I know I sound crazy, but the worst part is that if I tell anyone, they'll think I'm crazy too. So I've been debating whether or not I actually saw the werewolf that the lady described, or if it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I live in a very secluded, woodsy part of a small southern town. It's really peaceful during the day, but it gets a little scary at night. There are a few houses on my road, but for the most part it's only trees. There are a few reoccurring events that are all pretty spooky, but the main one is what my friends and I call the Dogman. For lack of a better name, I've only seen it twice in my life. I've lived in this part of town for 3 years. The Dogman has a body shaped like that of a scrawny human. Its bones are very visible. It has fur but only in patches over its body, sort of like a dog with mange. Though it has the bodily proportions of a person. It has the head of a dog and can run extremely fast and is huge. To preface, my room is at the front of the house. Our front yard is the size of a field. I have the biggest windows in the house in my bedroom, and it faces the front yard. I do not have blinds over my windows, as my bed is in front of it. The first time I saw the Dogman, it was late at night, and I was sitting in bed. I saw it running through the yard. Shortly after, my cat, who was an indoor/outdoor cat at the time, came inside growling. The cat was found dead across the creek near my yard this July. He had no visible injuries and was very young and healthy. We still don't know how he died. The second time I saw it was earlier tonight. My friends and I were sitting on my porch when we noticed a very large moving mass on the base of the mountain, which we lived right in front of, and we decided to get a closer look. My friend stayed behind to watch as my grandfather and I drove down the road to the base of the mountain. I didn't want to drive there alone. As we approached it, we stopped in front of the mass. It was a tree. Something then sprinted out from behind it and into the woods to the right of us. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. It was a Dogman. If you have any ideas to what the hell this is or how I can go about finding out more, I'd love to hear about it. It is really freaking us out. Something really creepy is happening at my house, and I've been debating whether I should share this or not. It's really starting to freak me out, and I'm asking for your help. I live in a pretty rural area in Michigan close to the lake. and I'm currently living alone. Both my parents are in Canada, taking care of my great uncle who's in his late 80s, and they've been gone for a month or so, and probably won't be back until late December. I'm 19, and I'm old enough to be alone. But some really odd things have been happening in the last 2 weeks. It started back in September, when my 15-year-old cat Ginger Snap went missing. At first, I figured she had passed away since she was very old and had a few health problems already. And a few days later, I found her body completely torn to shreds on my back porch. I mean, she was severely mutilated to the point where I threw up while sobbing hysterically. I came to the conclusion that it must have been a bird of prey, since we have some big owls and hawks where I live. A few days passed, and on the 4th of October, something odd happened. I was watching TV around 11 p.m. and kept hearing a really fast knocking sound. It would come in sets of 5s and then stop for a while and start again. I ended up going outside to investigate but couldn't see anyone. There was a really horrific smell. Then, what happened last night? I was awoken at about 3 a.m., which happens sometimes if I get a really messed up dream. I walked down the hall to grab a drink and thought perhaps I'd watch some TV to put me back to sleep. While I got to the fridge, which is right next to the back porch, I heard something walking around. I froze up and stayed completely still. I looked over to the door and saw a huge shadow. It was kind of crouched on its hands. I didn't really think it saw me, but it looked human. It didn't move for a whole 3 minutes before the shadow moved in the blink of an eye, and it was suddenly gone. I, nearly wetting myself, ran back to my room and called the cops. When they got there, they couldn't find anything, but they told me there was no way it was a person, since our back porch is suspended about 15 feet in the air, and there was no ladder. A few days passed, and it got me thinking. The loneliness was starting to get to me, so I decided to visit a friend, and I stayed at his house for 2 days for my safety. I spoke with my neighbor Graham, who's 84. I think it's important to say that during my walk to Graham's home, it takes me a good 10 minutes to get there, I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I kept hearing leaves and sticks breaking, and I swear to God I heard my father's voice at one point, but it could have all been in my head. Once I got to Graham's home, everything was fine. He was a nice man, a widower. He had me come in and we spoke about normal things at first, and he told me how he missed having his grandkids over in the summer, and other things like that. Then, after a small conversation, I finally told him what had been happening. Of course, we talked about it being a bear or a rabid lynx, but the more I told him, the more nervous he got. He told me that in the late 60s, shortly after him and his wife had got married, her 17-year-old sister had gone missing in the woods. Apparently the cops never investigated before, as they believed she'd just run off and joined some hippie commune, which to them at the time made sense, but something that kind of freaked me out. He said I looked like she did, only with colored hair. At this point I asked if he knew any of the lore of the area. He told me his grandma used to tell him stories, and that this land used to belong to her people before the colonizers took it, and she would tell him to never play outside during the winter, or the Whitaker would get him. He asked if I wanted to lay a few traps around the house, and I said yes. I even offered to pay him, but he turned me down. A true gentleman. Now I'm just really scared as I don't know what a Whitaker is, or if someone could tell me that'd be great. A few days passed, and I called Graham back. He asked me if I'd come home early, and I said no, and asked him why. He proceeded to tell me that on his walks to check the traps that he placed around the house, he saw someone in my bedroom window, and figured it was me getting some clothes. That's when I freaked out and drove over. Graham, who was armed, walked through the house. Nothing had been taken or moved, but something had been left on my bed. I spent the next few hours sobbing. I was too afraid to be in that house. I don't ever want to go back. We called the cops that did a sweep of the house, and they said it was probably just a vagrant. What do I even do? This thing got in my house. I took the picture of the driveway of my friend's apartment. I called my mum, and she thinks I'm overreacting, and even asked if I was smoking something. The audacity. I just feel so helpless. I spent the next 2 weeks jumping between friends' houses, couch surfing. But that no longer became an option, because it was when the COVID pandemic started and I had to quarantine at home. I was there for 72 hours and was already regretting not renting a hotel. Remember, at the time, we weren't supposed to be quarantined for that long, and I didn't think it would last all that. The tapping had gotten worse. I wish I'd have taken a few audio recordings. It easily lasted 15 minutes plus. I could no longer ask my friend to come over, Mr. Graham, since I didn't want to expose him if I had it, but he would text me every day to make sure I was fine. The trail cams and traps he set up hadn't yielded anything much besides pictures of wildlife and the occasional odd sound that we think is a voice whispering, but again could also be nothing. After a lot of research, I think this is a physical entity, but I don't know which one. Could it be a dogman, werewolf, Bigfoot, or a Wendigo? I'm really scared of getting into the house again, especially its little offerings that it left me, which I found out was made of red clay and freshwater nail shells, and a piece of rock. I have vivid nightmares about it getting in, or killing me. My parents are still in Canada. Because of the spikes in cases, they're not going to be able to get back much sooner. I'm just hoping to push this through until it loses interest in me. After an age, the harassment came to an end. One night, as always, I was home alone in the house when I heard something. I approached the stairs and I felt something attack me. I used my keys, which I had on me, and plunged them into the creature and then fled. I got free. I called the cops, and when they came there was no evidence. For the sake of not looking crazy or sounding it, I said it was a person, but of course it wasn't. I don't even know what it was. I have officially moved up since then, and am currently getting a new job and phone. My parents are stuck in Canada, and I think they will be for a while. I'm not going back, and haven't heard from Mr. Graham, and don't know if he's okay, and no longer have the means of going to check. 10 years ago, in a little town outside of Toulouse, France, right after dark, we were waiting for a restaurant to open. Our big group of family, Americans, took a while to walk up a hill and look at the town graveyard from the road. Walking back, we could see the whole town below us, the road ahead lined with stone walls in front of houses. About 100 yards ahead, illuminated by the streetlight, I see a huge black dog-shaped thing leave our sidewalk, hop into the middle of the street, rise up on its hind legs, and quickly scale and disappear over the 8-foot stone wall opposite. There were cars, bushes, and gates to use for visual scale, and this thing was at least 7 to 8 feet tall. Picture the werewolf from the film Prisoner of Azkaban. Yep, that's it, spot on. My family was chattering away about whatever, but I said, "Did you see that?" And my son just nonchalantly goes, "Oh yeah, that was a werewolf." We walked by the spot a minute later, and everyone laughed, but I know what I saw. We have dense woods behind my house, and one evening I hear a dog barking up a storm. I ran outside to see what it was, and near our grapevine stood this wolf-like creature that was about the size of a bear. I freaked out when it made eye contact with me. It just stood there about 10 yards away, staring. I grabbed my dog and ran inside to tell my parents. They wrote it off as my imagination, since I was about 10 to 12 at the time. But since then, when I go into the woods, it feels like I'm being watched. I'm 17 now, and still have a vivid memory of it. Me, my two brothers, and his girlfriend were out enjoying a beautiful sunset at one of the many beautiful nature spots we enjoyed going to. There was a lake there, so my brothers were fishing off the edge as we sat and made a fire and watched. We had been there quite a while. It was starting to get kind of dark now, and usually that means it's really dark inside the woods, and we still needed to walk back to the car. So as we were getting ready to go, everything got dead silent. It was odd. Birds had gone quiet. The sound of squirrels had stopped. Woodchucks, everything. Silence. Out of nowhere, we began hearing howling and yipping from coyotes. They didn't sound too far off. It sounded like there could have been 20 of them. My brother picked up his 12 gauge and he told us all to move quickly. If the coyotes were hungry and in a big pack, it could mean trouble. We were in full sprint back to the car, and the coyotes sounded like they were getting ever closer. At one point, it felt like they were right on our tail. It was pretty scary. Although, at the time it seemed like they were after us, but it got me thinking, perhaps they were running from something, because no coyotes attacked us when we'd stopped to get to the car, and there were 4 of us, and we had to stop to open the doors. If they were after us, they could have easily taken one of us at that point, but right as we reached the car, it sounded as though they made a turn and left and went running off in a different direction. We were too spooked to check and wanted to get the hell out of there. On our way home, we have this little pull-off that runs parallel to the main road. My brother noticed a little sign made by hand in the woods that said, Werewolf Hollow. Mind you, we've lived here all our lives and have never seen this sign before. So at the entrance is a turning, and my brother decides to take it out of curiosity. Along this pull-off is a guardrail. Behind the guardrail is a good 70-foot drop to a sheep farm in our area. As we rounded the turn and could no longer see where we had just come from, do we see this creature, big, hairy, with pointed ears like that of a German shepherd, piercing greenish-yellow eyes. Its hands seemed to hang down to its knees, and it appeared to be at least 8 foot tall, hunched over. As we came around the bend, my brother stopped in the middle of the road, this thing looking at our headlights while we were still trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It didn't look like a bear. What the hell else could it have been? After a few seconds, this thing turns back around, takes one hand, and lifts itself off the ground and drops the 70 feet down in the guardrail in one swift motion. We were all too creeped out at that point and sped home. The next day, my brother and I went down to the farm at the bottom of the 70-foot drop to see if the thing had survived the jump. We told them that we had seen something and asked if we could walk to the edge of the property to find the remains of what had fallen. As we walked, the farmer was telling us about how sheep had been coming up dead with their throats torn out, and said it was the strangest thing because most game in the area hunt food to eat, and these attacks seemed vicious, without purpose. He also told us that they had had the saliva tested around one of the sheep, and it tested positive for an unknown canine. The wood sign at the entrance of the pool was gone as well when we had gone back during the day. We all saw this same thing. It definitely wasn't a hallucination. Does anyone have any suggestions? It has been itching at the back of my mind for too long now, and has been plaguing my nightmares for months. I was out hunting with my older brother and his best friend a few years back. I want to say 2016. We had been walking along a trail a good 5 kilometers. On one side of the trail is a decent drop, and then a river, and then on the other side is a decent uphill section with a huge pine forest. It was about 1 a.m. at this point, and we were just sort of quietly talking to each other, when a horrific noise split the air. We all froze and looked at each other with confused expressions on our faces. We knew it came from the pine forest, and where we were there weren't any big predators, or really anything out there that we should be afraid of. So we shouldered our rifles and headed up to find out what exactly made the sound. I wish we hadn't. We got to a clearing, and the trees were thinning out, and my brother flicked on his spotlight. Big, bright, excellent range. Way up ahead of us was the strangest looking figure I've ever seen, like the general shape of a wolf, but off. It was just stopped on the edge of another tree line further up the hill, looking right at us, pacing side to side. My brother's friends and I had our rifles trained on it while trying to get a look. We couldn't count out the fact that it could be another hunter's dog that was lost, so we, against my gut feeling, went up after it. And as we did, it became increasingly obvious this thing was watching us very intently. The closer we got, the more we realized it definitely wasn't a hunter's dog. It was big, real big, and the way it moved and its entire demeanor was oh so unsettling. We kept 2 rifles on it, and 1 in the opposite direction. We slowly made our way back down and haven't been back there since. I really don't like talking about it, as we still don't know what we saw, and people usually jump to the BS conclusion because, as I said before, where we live there really isn't any big predators. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed tonight's werewolf and cryptid stories. Certainly leaves a lot to think about. If you did, you know what to do. Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram, and become a superfan. And I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all my amazing members, patrons, and coffee supporters, whose links, if you want to join, can be found in the description. And if you do join, you get your name at the very end of the video, which I think is a pretty cool and nice perk to have. Alright then guys, stay awesome, stay safe. Remember, any werewolf sightings, I want to know and hear about them, so my emails are open. And I'll see you in the next one.